She arrived early, before most of the morning rush began. The hospital lobby was quiet, filled with the soft hum of lights and the distant sound of carts rolling somewhere down the hallway. She paused for a moment near the entrance, adjusting the sleeve of her simple jacket, as if preparing herself for something more than just a routine check. To anyone watching, she looked like any other patient. There was nothing that stood out at first glance. No uniform, no signs of rank, no visible urgency. Just a woman in her early 30s, calm, steady, and almost too composed for someone visiting a medical facility. Her eyes moved around the room, not in fear, but in quiet awareness, as if she noticed everything without trying. She walked up to the front desk and gave her name in a low, polite voice. The receptionist nodded, typing it into the system without much interest. It was just another appointment on a long list of appointments. "Please have a seat. They'll call you shortly," the receptionist said, offering a practiced smile. She nodded once and stepped away, choosing a chair in the corner of the waiting area. It was a spot where she could see both the entrance and the hallway leading deeper into the hospital. It didn't look like a deliberate choice, but it was. She sat down carefully, placing her hands together in her lap. For a few moments, she simply breathed, slow and steady. Around her, the hospital slowly came to life. Nurses walked past with clipboards, doctors spoke quietly to each other, and a few other patients trickled in, each carrying their own worries. No one paid attention to her, and she seemed perfectly fine with that. A nurse passed by with a stack of files and stopped briefly at the front desk. Their voices were low, but in the quiet space, a few words carried. "She worked with SEALs, apparently," the receptionist whispered, glancing toward the screen. The nurse raised an eyebrow. "SEALs? Are you sure? That's what it says here. Listed as a medic attached during deployment." The nurse gave a small, confused laugh. "Doesn't look like it." The receptionist shrugged. "Maybe it's a mistake." The conversation ended as quickly as it started, but the words lingered in the air. The nurse couldn't help but glance toward her for a second. There was curiosity in that look, but also doubt. The idea didn't seem to match what they saw. A quiet woman sitting alone, hands folded, eyes calm. There was nothing about her that fit the image they had in mind. She didn't react. If she heard them, she didn't show it. Her expression remained unchanged, her gaze soft and distant. But deep inside, something shifted, just slightly. Not discomfort, not fear, just a familiar feeling of being misunderstood. A few minutes later, another nurse stepped into the waiting area and called her name. She stood up immediately, smooth and steady, as if she had been ready the entire time. "This way," the nurse said kindly, gesturing toward the hallway. She followed without a word. As they walked, the nurse glanced at her file briefly. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second, before the nurse looked up again. "You're here for a routine check, right?" she asked. "Yes," she replied softly. The nurse nodded, though something in her expression suggested she had more questions. Still, she didn't ask them. They continued walking in silence until they reached a small examination room. "Please have a seat. The doctor will be in shortly." "Thank you." She sat down on the edge of the examination bed, her posture straight but relaxed. The room was simple, white walls, a small cabinet, a monitor, and the faint smell of antiseptic. It was a space designed for quick visits, nothing more. She looked around briefly, then let her gaze settle on the floor. Time passed quietly. Outside, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Voices came and went. The hospital was fully awake now, moving at its usual pace. But inside that small room, everything felt still. She reached up absent-mindedly and adjusted her sleeve again. For a moment, the fabric shifted just enough to reveal faint marks along her forearm. They were not fresh, not dramatic, but they were there, thin lines, uneven, carrying stories that no one in this building could see clearly. She quickly pulled the sleeve back into place. The door opened gently, and a young doctor stepped in, holding a tablet. "Good morning," he said, offering a polite smile. "I'll be handling your check today." She nodded in return. He began asking the usual questions: general health, any concerns, any recent issues. She answered simply without adding extra details. Her voice remained calm, steady, and respectful. The doctor seemed satisfied at first, but as he scrolled through her file, his expression changed slightly. Not alarmed, but curious. "I see here you've had some unusual assignments," he said carefully, choosing his words. She didn't respond immediately. "Just support roles," she said after a brief pause. He looked at her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to ask more. In the end, he didn't push. He nodded and continued with the check. Still, something about her stayed with him. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that didn't need it. Outside the room, the earlier conversation had spread, as these things often do. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just small whispers between staff members. "Did you hear? That patient. She's listed as working with SEALs." "No way." "Yeah, but she doesn't look like it at all." "What does that even mean?" "I don't know. I just expected someone different." The curiosity grew, but so did the confusion. Why would someone like her be here alone? No escorts, no recognition, no sign of importance. Just a quiet appointment like anyone else. Back in the room, the check continued. The doctor remained professional, but his questions became slightly more careful, more thoughtful. He noticed small details, the way she reacted to certain movements, the brief pauses before some answers. He didn't fully understand what he was seeing, but he knew there was more beneath the surface. She, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, as if this was the simplest part of her life. At one point, the doctor asked her to roll up her sleeve for a routine check. She hesitated, not long enough to seem unusual, but just enough to feel it. Then she did it. The faint marks on her arm became visible again, clearer this time. The doctor noticed them, of course. It was his job to notice. But he didn't comment. Not yet. The air in the room shifted slightly, almost unnoticeable, but real. Some stories don't need to be told right away. They sit quietly, waiting for the right moment. And somehow, without anyone saying it out loud, it felt like that moment was getting closer. Outside, the hospital continued as normal. People moved, talked, worked, unaware that something quiet but important was unfolding in one small room. And in that room, she sat calmly, as she always did, unseen, unrecognized, and carrying far more than anyone around her could imagine. The question still lingered in the air, unspoken but growing stronger with every passing minute. Why was she really here? The examination was nearly finished when something unexpected shifted the quiet rhythm of the room. The doctor had just stepped aside to note a few final details on his tablet. The nurse was preparing to take a final reading. Everything felt routine again, almost ordinary. The kind of visit that would be completed, signed off, and forgotten within minutes. Then the door opened without a knock. It wasn't forceful, but it carried a kind of presence that made both the doctor and the nurse look up immediately. An older man stepped inside, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform that carried authority without needing to announce it. His posture was straight, his movements calm but firm. There was no confusion about who he was, even for those who had never met him before. The doctor quickly straightened. "Sir." The Admiral raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to signal that there was no need for formality in that moment. "I was passing through," he said in a steady, measured voice. "I was told there was a patient here connected to one of our units." His tone was neutral, but there was a quiet curiosity behind it. The nurse glanced at the doctor, unsure how to respond. The doctor hesitated for a second, then gestured gently toward her. "She's here for a routine check," he said. "Everything is under control." The Admiral nodded once, then shifted his attention toward her. For the first time since he entered, his eyes settled on her fully. She remained seated on the edge of the examination bed, just as she had been before. Her posture didn't change. Her expression stayed calm, almost unreadable. If his presence affected her, she didn't show it. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. There was no tension in the air, but there was something else. Something heavier, quieter. Recognition didn't come immediately. not in a clear or obvious way, but something about her felt familiar to him, like a memory that hadn't fully surfaced yet. He took a step closer, his gaze shifting slightly as he noticed the details. Her hands, resting calmly in her lap. The way her shoulders stayed relaxed, but ready. And then, almost without meaning to, his eyes moved to her arm. Her sleeve was still rolled up slightly from the check. The marks were visible. Not dramatic. Not something that would draw attention from across the room. But up close, they told a story that couldn't be ignored. The Admiral's expression changed. It wasn't shock. It wasn't even surprise. It was recognition. A quiet, immediate understanding that these were not random or recent. They were old, carried over time, left behind by something that required strength, patience, and endurance. He didn't look away right away. Instead, he spoke. "Where did you serve?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. The doctor and nurse both fell completely silent. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. There was no fear in her eyes. No need to impress. No need to explain more than necessary. "Where I was needed," she replied softly. It wasn't the kind of answer most people would give. It didn't offer details or locations. But it wasn't meant to. The Admiral studied her for a moment longer. Most people would have pressed further. Asked for specifics. Requested records. He didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he already suspected. The room remained quiet, but the feeling inside it had shifted completely. The doctor cleared his throat gently, trying to bring the moment back to something familiar. "We were just finishing up here. Everything seems stable." The Admiral gave a brief nod, but his attention didn't leave her. "You've been seen regularly?" he asked. "Yes." "No complications?" "No." Her answers were short, but not dismissive. She spoke with a calm certainty that made it clear she understood her own condition better than anyone else in the room. The Admiral's eyes softened slightly. It wasn't sympathy. It was respect. "You came alone?" he asked. "Yes." Another simple answer. The nurse shifted slightly, sensing that this conversation was moving beyond anything they were used to. She glanced at the doctor again, but he didn't interrupt. The Admiral took a slow breath, then stepped a little closer. Not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that showed he was trying to understand. "Most people with your background don't come in quietly," he said. "They don't sit in waiting rooms without someone knowing who they are." She gave the faintest hint of a smile. "I prefer it that way." There was no bitterness in her voice. No frustration. Just honesty. The Admiral let out a quiet breath, almost like a soft acknowledgement. "I can see that." For a moment, neither of them spoke again. But the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding. He looked once more at her arm, then back at her face. "Those didn't come from training," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She didn't respond right away. The doctor felt a slight tension in his chest, unsure if he should step in. The nurse stood still, barely moving. Finally, she spoke. "No," she said gently. "They didn't. That was all. No explanation. No story. But it was enough." The Admiral nodded slowly. Something in his posture changed then. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. He wasn't just looking at a patient anymore. He was looking at someone who had carried something heavy, and chosen to carry it quietly. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said after a moment. She looked at him, her expression steady. "I didn't expect to be noticed." There was no challenge in her words, just truth. The Admiral almost smiled, but it didn't fully reach his face. "That's usually how it happens," he said. The doctor finally spoke again, his voice careful. "Is there anything else you'd like us to check, sir?" The Admiral shook his head slightly. "No. You've done your job." Then he looked at her one more time. "You're cleared to leave after this?" he asked. "Yes." He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then he nodded. "Good." He turned slightly, as if preparing to leave, but paused at the door. Without looking back, he spoke one last time. "Some things don't stay hidden forever." Then he stepped out of the room. The door closed softly behind him. For a few seconds, no one moved. The doctor looked down at his tablet, but he wasn't really reading anything. The nurse adjusted the equipment, though everything was already in place. And she remained exactly where she was. Calm. Still. Unchanged. But something had shifted. Not just in the room. In how she was seen. The doctor finally looked up again. "Your check is complete," he said, his voice quieter than before. "You're free to go." She nodded and slowly lowered her sleeve back into place, covering the marks once again. As she stood up, there was no sign that anything unusual had just happened. No pride, no hesitation, just the same quiet presence she had walked in with. She thanked them politely and moved toward the door. But as she stepped into the hallway, she could feel it. The subtle difference. The way a few people looked at her now, not with confusion but with curiosity. With questions they didn't yet know how to ask. And somewhere down the corridor, the Admiral had stopped walking. Just for a moment. As if thinking. As if remembering. Then he continued on, his expression more serious than before. Because now he knew. There was more to her story. And this was only the beginning of it. She stepped out of the examination room and into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind her. The hospital felt different now, even though nothing had visibly changed. The same people moved through the corridors, the same sounds echoed off the walls, but the air around her felt heavier, as if something unspoken had begun to follow her. She walked at a steady pace, neither rushing nor slowing down. Her eyes stayed forward, calm and focused, but she could feel it. The subtle glances from staff who had heard something or sensed something. Not everyone knew what had happened in that room, but enough had noticed the Admiral's presence. And that alone was enough to change how they looked at her. She didn't react. She had learned a long time ago how to move through spaces without drawing attention, even when attention found her anyway. As she turned a corner, her steps slowed slightly. There was a small waiting area near the exit, quieter than the main lobby. She paused there, not because she needed to rest, but because something inside her had started to stir. It wasn't fear. It was memory. She sat down in an empty chair, her hands resting lightly on her knees. For a moment, she closed her eyes. Not fully, just enough to soften the world around her. And then, without warning, the past began to return. Not in loud flashes or overwhelming images, but in quiet pieces. A distant place, far from the calm of hospital walls. A place where the nights were long and the air carried a constant tension that never fully faded. She remembered how the ground felt under her boots, uneven and dry. How the wind would move through everything, carrying sounds that didn't always make sense at first. She had been there not as a soldier but as a medic. At least that's what the title said. In reality, it had been much more than that. She remembered the first time she arrived. The way people looked at her. Some with doubt, some with quiet curiosity. She wasn't what they expected. She didn't fit the usual image. But that didn't matter for long. Because in that kind of place, people didn't care about expectations. They cared about who showed up when it mattered. And she always showed up. The memory shifted. Long nights where sleep was rare and never deep. She would sit in small, dimly lit spaces, checking supplies, preparing for things she couldn't predict. There was always a sense that something could happen at any moment. But she never complained. She never asked to leave. There were moments when everything became still, almost peaceful. She would sit quietly, listening to the silence, knowing it wouldn't last. Those were the moments she allowed herself to breathe, even if only for a few seconds. Then came the harder parts. Not loud or dramatic, but heavy in a different way. She remembered sitting beside someone who needed help, offering what she could with steady hands and a calm voice. She didn't think about herself in those moments. There wasn't time for that. Her focus was always on the person in front of her. Always. The marks on her arms. They came from those times. Not from a single event, but from many. Small moments that added up. Moments where she had to move quickly, think clearly, and stay calm even when everything around her felt uncertain. Moments where she didn't step back, even when she probably should have. But she never saw it as something special. It was just what needed to be done. The memory shifted again. A night that felt longer than the others. She had been sitting outside, looking at the sky. There were more stars than she had ever seen before, spread across the darkness in a way that almost didn't feel real. For a brief moment, she had forgotten where she was. Someone had sat down next to her, saying nothing at first. They didn't need to. In that place, silence often said more than words. After a while, they had asked her a simple question. "Why are you still here?" She had thought about it, but not for long. "Because someone has to be," she had said. It wasn't a dramatic answer. It was just the truth. She didn't stay because she wanted recognition. She didn't stay because she felt strong. She stayed because leaving didn't feel right. Back in the present, her eyes slowly opened. The hospital returned around her. The soft lights, the quiet voices, the steady movement of people going about their day. For a moment, she just sat there, letting the two worlds settle. Past and present. Both real. Both part of her. She looked down at her hands, turning them slightly as if checking something only she could see. They were steady, just as they had always been. That hadn't changed. Footsteps approached from down the hallway, pulling her attention back. A nurse passed by, then paused for a second, as if considering whether to say something. In the end, the nurse gave her a small, respectful nod. Not curious, not doubtful, just respectful. She returned the nod softly. It was a small moment, but it carried more meaning than most people would notice. The way people looked at her was changing. Not all at once, but slowly, and she could feel it. She stood up after a few minutes, adjusting her jacket again. This time, her sleeve stayed firmly in place, covering everything beneath it. As she began walking toward the exit, her steps remained calm and steady. But her thoughts lingered. She had spent so much time keeping her past quiet, letting it stay where it belonged. Not hidden out of fear, but out of choice. Because she didn't need others to understand it. She didn't need them to see it. But now something had shifted. The Admiral's words echoed faintly in her mind. Some things don't stay hidden forever. She stepped into the main lobby again. It was busier now, filled with more voices, more movement, more life. For a moment, she blended into the crowd once more. Just another person passing through. But not entirely. There was a subtle difference now. In the way a few people glanced at her. In the way the receptionist looked up as she passed, offering a slightly more attentive smile than before. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. But the quiet curiosity had turned into something else. Something closer to understanding. As she reached the exit doors, she slowed for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the handle. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because she already knew. Her story wasn't fully invisible anymore. Not after today. And somewhere in the hospital, the Admiral was still thinking. Still putting pieces together. Still realizing that the woman who walked in alone for a routine check was not just a medic with a simple past. She carried something deeper. Something that couldn't be measured by records or titles. And now, whether she wanted it or not, that truth was beginning to surface. She pushed the door open and stepped outside into the daylight. The air felt different. Lighter. But also uncertain. Because for the first time in a long while, her past wasn't entirely behind her. And she didn't yet know what that would mean. But she kept walking anyway. Just as she always had. She had just stepped outside when she heard footsteps behind her. Not rushed, not loud, but steady enough to make her pause. She didn't turn immediately. Instead, she let a few seconds pass, her hands still resting lightly against the strap of her bag. The air outside the hospital was warmer, carrying the distant noise of traffic and people going about their day. Felt normal again. Then she turned. The Admiral was standing a few steps behind her. He hadn't called out. He hadn't tried to stop her in any obvious way. He had simply followed, as if he knew she would pause on her own. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, the difference between them felt smaller than it had inside the hospital. Without the walls, the uniforms, and the structure around them, it was just two people standing in a quiet space, carrying very different stories. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said finally, his voice calm. You're not, she replied. He gave a slight nod, as if he expected that answer. I didn't want to have this conversation in there, he said, glancing briefly back at the hospital entrance. Too many ears, too many assumptions. She understood what he meant. Places like that often filled in the blanks before anyone spoke the truth. They stood in silence again for a second, the kind that didn't feel uncomfortable. I've been going over your file, he continued, and what I saw in that room. She didn't respond right away. She simply listened. There are gaps, he said. Not mistakes, not missing records, just gaps. She let out a quiet breath, almost like a small acknowledgement. That was intentional. I figured. His tone didn't carry accusation. If anything, there was a quiet respect in it. He took a step closer, not too close, just enough to make the conversation feel more direct. Most people try to make their story bigger, he said. More visible, easier to recognize. She looked at him steadily. I didn't. No, he agreed. You didn't. There was something thoughtful in the way he said it, as if that alone told him more about her than any report ever could. For a moment, he seemed to search for the right words. I've met a lot of people over the years, he said slowly. Different roles, different experiences. Some speak loudly about what they've done. Some don't need to. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened slightly. I never saw the point in speaking about it, she said quietly. The work was already done. That's one way to see it, he replied. She tilted her head just slightly, as if considering whether to say more. It wasn't about hiding, she added. It was about moving forward. He studied her for a moment. And did you? He asked. She didn't answer immediately. That question stayed in the air longer than the others. I learned to, she said after a pause. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest. The Admiral nodded slowly, as if he understood what she wasn't saying as much as what she was. I recognized the signs, he said, his voice quieter now. Not just the marks, the way you carry yourself, the way you respond. She didn't look surprised. You've seen it before, she said. Yes. There was no need for him to explain further. People like him didn't reach his position without seeing things most others never would. They stood there, both aware that this conversation had moved far beyond introductions or simple curiosity. I'm not here to question your choices, he said, and I'm not here to ask for details you don't want to share. She gave a small nod. But I do want to understand one thing, he continued. She waited. Why come here like this? He asked. No notice, no support, just a routine check, like none of it matters. For the first time, she looked away, not out of discomfort but out of thought. Her eyes moved briefly toward the street, watching a car pass by, then settle again somewhere in the distance. Because it doesn't, she said softly. He didn't interrupt. What happened before? It's part of me, she continued, but it's not something I need to carry into every room. There was no emotion in her voice, but there was weight. I didn't come here as anything special, she added, just someone making sure everything is still, steady. The Admiral listened carefully. That's not how most people would handle it, he said. I know. Then why you? She turned her gaze back to him. Because I had time to think, she said. Out there, there's no space for that. You just act. You respond. You keep going. He nodded slightly. But when it's over, she continued, you realize something. He waited. That you can't live the rest of your life the same way. The words were simple, but they carried something deeper. Some people hold on to it, she said. They need it to define them. And you don't. She shook her head gently. I remember it, she said. I respect it. But I don't need it to speak for me. The Admiral let out a slow breath. There was something in her answer that settled a question he hadn't fully formed until now. You chose to stay quiet, he said. Yes. Even when people didn't understand. Yes. He gave a faint smile, though it didn't carry humor. That takes a different kind of strength. She didn't respond to that. Not because she disagreed, but because she didn't see it that way. To her, it was simply a choice. Nothing more. They stood there for a moment longer, the conversation slowing naturally. Then the Admiral reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He held it out to her. "If you ever need anything," he said, "or if there's ever a reason you don't want to walk into a place like that alone." She looked at the card, then back at him. "You won't have to." She took the card, her fingers brushing against it lightly. "Thank you," she said. There was no hesitation in her voice, just appreciation. He nodded once, then stepped back slightly. "I won't press you any further," he said. "Your story is yours to keep or share." She gave a small, understanding nod. "But for what it's worth," he added, "I'm glad I noticed." That caught her attention, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no pride in it, no sense of authority, just sincerity. For a brief moment, her expression softened in a way it hadn't before. "I am too," she said quietly. The Admiral gave one last nod, then turned and began walking back toward the hospital. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The conversation had said enough. She stood there for a few seconds after he left, the card still in her hand. The world around her moved as it always did. Cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause. But something inside her had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, but enough. She looked down at the card again, then carefully placed it in her pocket. For years, she had chosen to move forward without looking back. To keep things simple, quiet, uncomplicated, and for the most part it had worked. But now, for the first time, it felt like the past and present had crossed paths in a way she couldn't fully ignore. Not in a negative way, just differently. She took a slow breath, letting it out steadily. Then she adjusted her jacket, straightened her posture slightly, and began walking. Not away from anything, not toward anything specific. Just forward, the same way she always had. But this time, there was a quiet awareness following her. That maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. And that maybe being seen wasn't the same as being exposed. It was something else. Something she was only just beginning to understand. She didn't rush after leaving the hospital. There was no reason to. The road ahead stretched quietly, lined with trees that moved gently in the afternoon breeze. The world felt steady, almost too normal compared to the thoughts moving through her mind. Cars passed by, people talked in low voices, and somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Life continued just as it always did. She walked along the sidewalk, her pace even, her posture relaxed. From the outside, nothing about her seemed different from anyone else. But inside, something had shifted in a way she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't the conversation itself. It was what came after. For a long time, she had lived in a space where her past stayed behind her. Not erased, not forgotten. Just placed somewhere quiet. Somewhere it wouldn't follow her into every part of her life. And she had been comfortable with that. More than comfortable. It gave her control. It gave her peace. But now that quiet space had been touched. Not broken, not taken away, just seen. And that felt unfamiliar. She slowed her steps slightly as she reached a small park just a short distance from the hospital. It wasn't crowded. A few people sat on benches, some looking at their phones, others simply watching the day pass. She chose a bench near the edge, where she could sit without being in the center of everything. For a moment, she just sat there, her hands resting lightly together, her eyes moving across the open space. There was nothing demanding her attention, nothing pulling her in different directions, just stillness. She reached into her pocket and took out the card the Admiral had given her. It was simple, clean, just a name, a number, and a position that carried more meaning than the card itself showed. She turned it slightly between her fingers, studying it in silence. For years, she had avoided things like this. Connections, recognition, support that came from people who understood too much. Not because she didn't trust it, but because she didn't feel she needed it. Out there, she had learned to rely on herself, to think clearly, act quickly, and carry whatever came without expecting someone else to step in. That mindset didn't disappear when she left. It stayed, quietly shaping everything she did. She looked down at the card again, her expression thoughtful. The Admiral hadn't forced anything on her. He hadn't asked for details she didn't want to share. He had simply offered something, and left the choice with her. That was what made it different. She placed the card back into her pocket, not as something she needed right now, but as something she didn't have to ignore anymore. That alone felt new. A soft sound nearby pulled her attention away. An older man was sitting a few benches away, struggling slightly to open a bottle of water. His hands moved carefully, but the grip wasn't steady enough. Without thinking, she stood up and walked over. "Here," she said gently, reaching out. He looked up, a little surprised, then smiled faintly as he handed her the bottle. She opened it with ease and gave it back. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." There was no long conversation, no questions, just a small moment. But as she turned to walk back to her bench, something about it stayed with her. It reminded her of something simple, that helping didn't always come in big ways. It didn't need a title. It didn't need a past. It just needed presence. She sat down again, her thoughts quieter now. For the first time since leaving the hospital, her mind wasn't moving between past and present. It was just here. Time passed slowly. The light shifted as the afternoon moved forward, casting longer shadows across the ground. The park grew a little quieter, the small movements of people becoming fewer. She stood up after a while, adjusting her jacket as she prepared to leave. There was no hesitation in her steps, no weight pulling her back, just a calm sense of direction. As she walked away from the park, she passed by a small group of people talking near the entrance. Their conversation paused for just a second as she moved past them. Not in a way that felt intrusive, just awareness. She didn't look at them directly, but she could feel it, the subtle shift in how people noticed her now. Not because they knew her story, but because something about her carried a quiet presence that wasn't easy to ignore. Before, it had gone unseen. Now it was simply there. She continued walking. The streets became more familiar as she moved farther from the hospital. Buildings she had passed before, places she had seen without thinking twice. Everything looked the same, but she didn't feel exactly the same. There was a difference, small but clear. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to keep everything separate. Her past didn't have to stay locked away, and her present didn't have to pretend it didn't exist. They could both be there, without conflict, without pressure, just part of the same path. As she reached the corner of the street, she paused briefly, looking ahead. There were still questions, still things she hadn't fully figured out. But for once, that didn't bother her. Not everything needed to be answered right away. Some things could unfold slowly, naturally. She took a breath, steady and calm. Then she continued walking. Back at the hospital, the quiet shift she had left behind continued to move through the halls. The doctor who had seen her sat at his desk, looking at her file again. It hadn't changed. The same information, the same gaps. But now it felt different. He wasn't looking for what was missing anymore. He was thinking about what couldn't be written down. The nurse who had been in the room moved through her tasks with the same routine, but her thoughts kept returning to that moment. The way the Admiral had spoken, the way the patient had answered. There had been no need for explanations, no need for proof, just understanding. Even the receptionist, who had first read the note about her file, found herself glancing at the door now and then, as if expecting something more. But nothing else happened. Because sometimes, the most important moments don't come with noise or attention. They happen quietly, and they stay. Later that evening, the Admiral stood near a window in his office, looking out at the fading light. His expression was thoughtful more than usual. He wasn't reviewing reports. He wasn't focused on schedules or decisions. His mind was on something else. On a quiet patient who had walked into a hospital alone. On the way she had answered questions without trying to explain herself. On the strength it took to carry something and not let it define you. He had seen many people in his career, many stories, many paths, But hers stayed with him in a way he hadn't expected. Not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. He reached into his pocket for a moment, then stopped. The card was no longer there. He nodded slightly to himself. That was enough. Because whether she chose to use it or not didn't matter as much as what it represented. Connection. An understanding. A quiet respect. Back on the street, she continued walking, the sky above her slowly shifting toward evening. There was no dramatic ending to her day. No sudden change. Just a steady continuation. But something inside her had settled. She wasn't just the past she carried. And she wasn't just the quiet life she had chosen after. She was both. And for the first time that felt clear. As she walked forward, her steps remained the same. Calm, steady, and certain. But now there was something else alongside them. Not weight, not pressure. Just a quiet sense that she didn't have to hide completely anymore. That being seen didn't mean losing control. It meant being understood, even if only by a few. And maybe that was enough. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because everything she needed to carry was already with her. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something she had to carry alone.